Welcome and thanks for joining today's presentation on battlefield preservation planning grants as a partnership tool. My name is Brian Fainer and I'm with the National Park Service and help support our Connected Conservation effort. The Connected Conservation webinar series focuses on how NPS staff and partners can use various tools and strategies to conserve natural, cultural, and recreation resources at the landscape level. You can register for future webinars and view our extensive library of past recordings on a variety of topics by going to our new publicly accessible NPS Connected Conservation website. I'll enter a link to the website into the chat box momentarily. Throughout today's presentation, please feel free to enter any questions you have into the questions box. We'll take a look at everyone's questions following the presentation. And as a reminder, our webinar series is open to the public, so we encourage you to invite your friends and colleagues to future webinars. Our presenter today is Emily Button Kambic, who is an archaeologist with the NPS's American Battlefield Protection Program. She manages a portfolio of battlefield preservation planning grants and works on program-wide outreach, preservation, consultation, and data management strategies. She previously served as in the National Capital Area as an acting National Historic Landmarks Program Coordinator. She began her work with the NPS as a park guide at Boston African-American National Historic Site while completing her PhD in anthropology at Brown University. And with that, Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much for having us on this webinar, and thanks everybody for joining us. I hope that it will be useful for you all as something to keep in your toolbox for the future and for partnerships. We're going to talk today about grants from the American Battlefield Protection Program with a focus on the Preservation Planning Grant Program, our expanded eligibility guidance for this year, and a discussion of potential partner and outreach opportunities. I'm going to tell you about the program and where it fits into our larger grant program for about 30 minutes. And then I'm going to ask you for some feedback, since I know many of you are from the National Park Service or close partners, about who could maybe use these grants, how we can get the word out, and what your thoughts are on barriers to entry and how we might be able to decrease them. So first, I want to give you a pitch on why you should listen to me talk about grants and why for battlefields in particular, given that I know many of the participants on this call are members of the National Park Service, which is funded by appropriations. Well, we all have partners, local groups, and contacts who do need support from beyond congressional appropriations. I'm sure many of us have seen needs within our communities for support and stimulation to do the kind of preservation and conservation work that might stretch beyond official partnerships and cooperative agreements. Grants can be a tool for meeting the needs of non-federal applicants in ways that other funding sources may not. And particularly when it comes to landscape level stewardship, we know that one really important principle is that a landscape doesn't necessarily end at the border of land ownership. And so land protection can't necessarily end at the end of the border of a park or a public land. So grants really help extend NPS's stewardship mission by giving money and options to other organizations for projects beyond federal lands that nevertheless are still connected. And then the other question that I want to start off with is, why should you care about battlefields? That can seem like a pretty niche concern within historic preservation. If you think about it, armed conflict is really interwoven throughout American history from the very, very beginning of what we consider the modern United States. For instance, our grants have funded projects on Spanish colonial conflicts in the 16th century in Florida and the Southwest, the formative conflicts known as the Pequot War and King Philip's War in 17th century New England, as well as the American Revolution, the War of 1812 and Civil War, and 19th century battles to control indigenous territories across the West. So many battlefields are tied into all of our areas of history, and many of them are large cultural landscapes themselves. Documenting and preserving the state of these landscapes at the period that battles took place can be part of larger strategies for conservation, as well as for public access to green spaces for communities who might value these lands for other purposes in addition to their history. And then this also ties into how we frame preservation. We don't think this is necessarily limited to the physical protection of a property frozen in time, but the National Park Service, I think, has a larger understanding of preservation and stewardship as tied into meaning making and being part of really the public interest. Education, community involvement, and more broadly understanding and protecting what makes places important to people are part of the purpose of preservation. So I wanted to give you that framing at the very beginning of this conversation about grants. So all of that is tied into talking about grants being a tool for partnerships, how they can be a funding source to help people come together and care for places that are important to them. Now, to introduce the American Battlefield Protection Program, this is a national program authorized by Congress and administered by the National Park Service for the purpose that is reprinted on this slide from our legislative authority, which I'm not going to do too much reading of slides, hopefully. And we are a program with 7 staff. We're located in the Cultural Resource Partnerships and Science Directorate within the Washington Support Office, and our offices are in Washington, D.C. And the primary way that we do assist citizens, public and private institutions, and governments is through financial assistance for preservation. We have 4 grant programs that have been authorized. 2 of them are active funding opportunities. One is the Preservation Planning Grant Program, which we're going to be focusing on this webinar. This program has the broadest scope in terms of being applicable for all periods of American history and not just sites identified in ABPP's reports to Congress on the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, and Civil War. I'll tell you about the wide range of activities that they do fund. They are a competitive annual grant competition, usually with appropriations and grants of about 1.9 million per year in recent years. I'm not going to go into detail on the other programs because I think you fairly recently heard from one of our frequent partners, the American Battlefield Trust, about battlefield land acquisition grants. But just to highlight that this is probably our flagship grant program, the best known and highest funded. This is a matching rolling program for state and local governments, often working in partnership with nonprofits to acquire lands from the 3 wars listed in this table. Usually it's funded and we give grants for about 10 to 13 million a year, but it can be appropriated up to 18 million a year. So these amounts may increase. The other 2 grant programs for interpretive modernization and battlefield restoration are newly authorized by the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act. We anticipated that these will be funded and become active at some point in the fiscal year 2021. They are not yet, so stand by for more information about these programs. I'm going to give you a couple quick examples of the land acquisition grants as they exemplify partnerships in conservation before moving into the planning grants. One of these grants that is a great example was a 2019 grant for a tract in the Fort Blakely battlefield in Alabama to the University of South Alabama, partnering with the Conservation Fund. Now, this really has multiple partnerships involved because the university is taking ownership of this tract as a state landowner, but it will be stewarded as part of the Fort Blakely State Park. The university's history and archaeology departments are interested in studying the site and using it as a living laboratory. A couple of the issues they may study are how African-American troops represented nearly half of the Union force at Fort Blakely, 6,000 to 9,000 soldiers, and also identifying whether the quarter mile of Civil War trenches it's believed may exist here, if and where those may be. In terms of natural resources, the property includes 34 acres of wetlands, nearly 2,000 feet of the Tensaw River, many trees, shrubs, swamps, and a rare Alabama holly. So this is really an example of engaged stewardship of natural and cultural resources and a research and conservation partnership that also supports education. Another example of a battlefield land acquisition grant being used to preserve a larger landscape, is the grant that was awarded for the preservation of Malvern Hill Farm in Virginia in 2017. And this is one of the only known place that we know of in the United States to experience troop activity during the Civil War, the War of 1812, and the Revolutionary War. And this was a partnership between the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation and the Capital Region Land Conservancy. They purchased the 871-acre Malvern Hill Farm when the property had been listed for sale and was being marketed for use as a residential subdivision. And instead, this site will now be preserved with a conservation easement held by the Virginia Board of Historic Resources. But in addition to these 871 acres, it's adjacent to over 2,300 acres of adjacent conserved lands, which together encompass more than 85% of the battlefield. So this grant came at an opportunity to preserve a property as part of a much larger natural and cultural landscape, preserving the forest and farmland, natural habitat, and water resources, as well as the farm that exemplifies these three wars. So those are land acquisition grants. And you'll note that the recipients of these grants were state agencies working in partnership with nonprofits, which is part of the structure of this program. Now I'm going to move into the preservation planning grants, which are open to other kinds of organizations like nonprofits. One of these grants was to a nonprofit called Shenandoah Alliance, and we've given them a couple of grants, Alliance for the Shenandoah Valley, and we've given them a couple of grants over time, but this first grant was one that helped build capacity for the merger of 3 local nonprofit organizations. And these 3 local conservation and community nonprofits partnered up to try to basically survive as a very small grassroots organization, and also to create partnerships with other larger organizations in their area, like the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. And their grant application for capacity building and their organization in general takes a really expansive view of battlefield preservation as part of heritage tourism and part of the preservation of rural community lifestyles that are very valued by people who live in the Shenandoah Valley. And so they wanted to bring together multiple groups with overlapping interests and grassroots origins to have a larger voice in local planning. And so their grant application in 2016 very clearly distinguished which activities, like a GIS database on local land use and current preservation status, would be funded by a battlefield preservation grant as specifically tied to battlefields versus what other activities they're doing that would not be funded by this grant, which is important when you're thinking about a project where battlefield preservation is part of a larger preservation strategy, not just for one battlefield, but for a region and for how people see battlefields as part of their history. So this organization also received a 2020 grant for a community visioning process around the preservation of the Port Republic and Cross Keys Civil War battlefields. Another planning effort that was funded by a preservation planning grant was a grant for land management planning to the city of Monroe, Michigan. And you may recognize River Raisin is a national park. Well, this grant was an example that I want to share because it brought together both local and national government units to try to compile information on the battlefield's history, cultural resources, and the landscape. It identified protected and non-protected lands and what their zoning classifications were, and made recommendations on how to manage different units for future preservation and current use and interpretation. So this grant really exemplifies an NPS Gateway Community Partnership that was led and managed by the community partner, not by the NPS unit. In this case, it was the local government. So they led this project, although they did take into account the National Park Service's role in preserving this large battlefield that stretched beyond the NPS and beyond the city owner's boundaries. So there are a lot of NPS battlefield parks or parks that happen to include histories of conflict that only preserve part of those larger sites. And these grants can, in some ways, be models for communities to take the lead with that collaborative planning. So I'm going to tell you a little about the basics of this grant program, who can apply and how. The Battlefield Preservation Planning grants fund documentation, research, planning, partnership building, interpretation, and outreach type activities. They can focus on battlefields and associated sites which I'll define soon, from any period in American history. They're awarded annually and chosen through competitive merit review. The awards don't have a official and defined maximum or minimum, but they generally range from $30,000 to $100,000, and they do not require a match. And applications should propose projects that are feasible to complete in 2 years. It is possible and has been done for projects to be phased and to compete for multiple grants in multiple cycles when they've shown they've completed a first phase successfully. Eligible applicants for these grants are state and local governments, institutes of higher education, private nonprofits with 501c3 status, and Native American governments, which in grants.gov terms includes federally recognized Native American tribal governments, other Native American tribal organizations, and Native Hawaiian organizations. The federal government, you will note, is not eligible to apply because the idea is that Congress has already authorized money for federal operations. Can a nonprofit or a local government working in partnership with a federal agency apply? The Monroe example just gave one example of how that may be possible, but we'll get to some of the questions we need to think through when talking about eligible activities. Now I'd like to give definitions. And this is part of our guidance that we've expanded this year due to requests from potential applicants and state historic preservation offices. So first, eligible armed conflicts have to focus on planning, interpreting, and preserving sites associated with armed conflicts that shape the growth and development of the United States. And the definition we're using here comes from a pretty widely used international, it's in wide international use. And armed conflicts are a period of collective violence characterized by specific events and bounded in time. Excuse me. Excuse me just a second. Thank you. So what I'd like to note about this armed conflict definition is that it does not require that a conflict be declared a war by Congress, for example. And so it is a little broader than, say, the specifics of the Civil War, World War I. So this can include conflicts that occurred, for example, before the United States was officially founded. I would also note that being characterized by specific events and bounded in time means that it's possible to propose a grant for a set of events or even a single event, such as a massacre, for example, but not necessarily a thematic study that isn't tied into events. And the projects must contribute to the preservation of battlefields or associated sites that are thematically tied with events that occur during an armed conflict. So they have to be based on, in some way, promoting the preservation and stewardship of specific places. They have to be place-based. And they may include battlefields and sites of collective violence, and also associated sites under a set of themes that ties in with the framework used in the ABPP's report on Revolutionary War and War of 1812 conflicts. And the reason that we are including sites that are associated with the conflict under these themes, such as military, intellectual history, society, and transportation, is in recognition that these kinds of sites can also be really important in how an armed conflict shaped American history. For example, associated sites could include forts, supply depots, and other kinds of infrastructure that are tied with preparation and defense, even if a battle was not fought at that site. Another example would be rail lines that provided critical supply and transport. In terms of the Civil War, that might include contraband camps, recruitment stations, and hospitals. These are some very 19th century examples, but we are open to proposals that apply this definition in different and historically grounded ways to projects that will be innovative for our program. And the full definitions will be available on our website and the grants.gov notice of funding opportunity as soon as that is ready to share, and the annual competition begins in early November, we hope. So this is something where if you have questions about it, I'd be happy to take them at the end, because this is a bit more expansive than what we have provided before. Eligible activities include, but are not limited to, the list that is on this slide. So it can include research, documentation, public programs, preservation planning, working with collections or exhibitions. There are a few ineligible activities. Lobbying and fundraising, always ineligible since this is a federal grant. Land acquisition is funded by other programs. Capital projects and bricks and mortar preservation work are not currently in the scope of this program. And then other ones that might harm a battlefield's integrity or are not within really the scope of our program. And I mentioned we get back to the question of partnerships with federal agencies. Projects on federal land or using federal resources or partnering with a federal agency can be funded if they meet the standards for financial assistance. So that means we need to consider questions like, does this project meet the public purpose requirement for federal funding? Just like a cooperative agreement, which some of you might have worked with, grants can't fund activities that are of direct benefit to the federal government, something that could otherwise be funded through the agency's operating budget or a contract. There has to be a public purpose outside of the agency's regular work to fulfill its mission. The other question to consider is also trying to think about the difference between partnership and substantial involvement. A grant-funded project should not be controlled and primarily driven by a federal agency. It definitely can't fund federal salaries for their work in a partnership. So these are some questions to consider with federal points of contact for partners, or we can also speak with you about questions about this and where a specific project might fall into the eligibility concerns for federal partnerships. Now I'm going to get us out of the weeds and talk about how we've applied these eligibility standards, or how we would apply these eligibility standards to a couple of recent grants. One grant in 2018 was a grant to the Pechanga Band of Indians in California. And the previous guidelines for eligibility for our program had said that specifically battlefields were eligible and a site had to be directly connected to a specific battle in the 2018 competition. And that left episodes of one-sided violence like the Temecula massacre in a pretty ambiguous space, because by definition, there was not an army that was on one side of that. And so the application at that time identified the Temecula massacre as a result of the Battle of San Pascual in 1846, a battle in the Mexican-American War that had happened weeks earlier. The new guidelines say that the sites have to be connected to an armed conflict. So that means it would simply be eligible as an event that occurred, an episode of violence that was part of the Mexican-American War. We wouldn't have to make this tie into the Battle of San Pascual specifically. So it's eligible in relation to a conflict, and it had preservation goals as a site-based project. The activities were to identify the resources associated with this massacre, which was a very sensitive site to the Pechanga Band. And so documenting them is an important step toward preservation, especially because they're not all on tribal land. Additionally, the grant included funding for oral history interviews and a documentary film about the meaning of this massacre and its resonance for the tribe. And this is an activity that might not immediately occur to everyone as being a preservation activity, but we think this is part of understanding the legacy of this battle and why this tribe is even interested in trying to preserve it. It's part of how they tell their story and their history. So we wanted to highlight this eligible activity as well. Another recent grant was a 2020 grant for the Fairfield Historical Society. That was the third in a three-part project to conduct archeological survey and eventually preserve and interpret findings from the Battle of Peakwater Maracama Swamp in Connecticut. And so the armed conflict this qualifies under is the Pequot War of 1636 and 1637 in New England. And the preservation goals of this project included, in the first grants, identification and documentation of the battlefield boundaries, identification of cultural resources within them, and interpreting this war and the battle for the broader public. So in the most recent grant, they are completing the collections documentation from their archaeological and historical survey, as well as a National Register nomination form. They're also conducting interpretation via exhibits within their museum, websites, and wayside installation within a public park. And so I'm walking through the eligibility considerations for this because including exhibit fabrication is a relatively recent addition to eligible activities for this program. But I also wanted to mention the importance of working with tribes for non-native led organizations like the Fairfield Historical Society. The National Park Service conducts tribal consultation regarding grant awards via Section 106, but we also strongly encourage recipients to work with tribes who share the history before and during their projects. So in this interpretation grant, the Fairfield Historical Society wrote into their scope and budget that they would hire a tribal consultant who's likely to be a member of one of the Pequot tribes to facilitate these conversations. This is really built into the project from the beginning, and we think it's very important for applicants focusing on difficult histories to work with people who have close ties and strong stakes in both those sites and how those stories are told. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the application cycle and process. This is a tentative review and award timeline. We expect the funding opportunity to be posted on grants.gov and open up for applications in early November, and hope that the application deadline will then be about 3 months later. We'll then conduct our internal review to make sure they're complete and begin our Section 106 reviews. We'll put them through a competitive merit review with a panel of subject matter experts and conduct financial, budget, and scope work prior to selecting grants for award. And then we expect them to be able to begin projects in summer 2021. Now, the applications go through grants.gov. People can search for them under CFDA number 15.926 when they're active, or the program name. The application package in grants.gov includes the giant notice of funding opportunity, which says what the program is, how to apply, what a grant agreement looks like, and so on, as well as a standard applications form we use, and they have to be submitted through grants.gov. The components of the application include standard forms for applying for a federal grant. Those are the 4 listed up at the top. We also ask for a project narrative addressing the criteria that they will actually be selected under, a budget narrative going into detail about how money will be used, a map of the sites being proposed for work, an indirect cost rate agreement, if applicable to the applicant, and then other optional supporting documents, for example, resumes and CVs. So there's a decent amount of work to do in preparing an application. We definitely encourage people who have questions about it to contact us and to start applications early. And how will applications be selected for funding? This is where our merit review criteria come in. Grants are scored under these criteria for a possible score of up to 100 points, and then selected for funding based on essentially their rank. So our criteria take into questions like preservation opportunity, which is about what does the project propose to do? How will it support the preservation of this battlefield, again, with a broad view of what preservation can mean. Objectives and activities is how do they plan to do this and what will be the outcomes. Administration and implementation looks at the qualifications of the people who will be working on it and the organization or applicant's ability to fulfill the work they're planning on. Partnerships and engagement is pretty important. We would we value partnerships between applicants, communities, other organizations, SHPOs, and Indian tribes, and so on. They can look different for every project, but we think this is such an important aspect of the program that partnerships and engagement are worth a fifth of the points. And then a couple of more specific, smaller criteria. The Secretary of the Interior priorities, ask how a project ties into priorities introduced by this administration. And then number 2, the FY 2021 focus areas makes 10 additional points available for areas where the program is particularly interested in funding this year. So those could be projects that focus on underrepresented sites and stories, and I'll give a few examples of what is underrepresented in this program, or projects that enhance our understanding of the origins of the United States. This is somewhat in recognition of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence coming up in 2026. When we really thought about what does this anniversary mean from the perspective of battlefield preservation, we are thinking about projects that address the histories of people who experienced the armed conflicts that led ultimately to American independence. Those could include conflicts like the Pueblo Revolt, the American Revolutionary War, Nat Turner's Rebellion. Again, we're interested in historically grounded examples that could still be a little bit unexpected or innovative. So we do have some goals for outreach, and this is one of the reasons we are excited to present to an NPS audience in this webinar, as well as partners who are on this webinar, is that we are really hoping that we can start to broaden our pool of new applicants this year, especially given that we do have expanded guidance on eligible armed conflicts and associated sites. There may be people and organizations out there who have projects in mind that are eligible for one of these grants, but have maybe never thought of themselves as a battlefield site and might not realize they're eligible under the associated site themes or under the umbrella of a site associated with a larger armed conflict. We'd also like to fund projects and organizations that can help us tell the full American story from many and diverse perspectives. And that is another reason that having a broader applicant pool and reaching out to more people about these opportunities can help strengthen this program, what we fund, and the impact that we have in the United States. There are also program areas that are not too well represented in our recent granting history, such as African American and Black history, projects that not only focus on conflicts with Indigenous people, but are Indigenous led. Projects focusing on associated sites, because again, these definitions are being provided for this grant program for the first time this year, as well as sites west of the Mississippi, which we do fund, but we fund a much larger proportion of grants in the East, where we maybe have more name recognition because of the land acquisition grant program. So these are all areas where we would love to see some growth and expansion. In terms of potential applications, we'll be providing some webinars for external non-NPS audiences tied into these themes in November. So please keep a lookout for that and share with your partners if you can. We're also looking forward to working with other external NPS programs like national heritage areas and potentially parks if anyone in this audience is interested about reaching out to your constituencies about these funding opportunities. And so I'm hoping to take some of our time today in discussion about who we should be trying to reach and how. But I'd like to stop talking here and first ask about questions from the audience.
Great, thanks Emily so much. Great presentation. Got the wheels turning for a lot of folks here. Again, folks, if you have questions, feel free to enter them into the questions box there, and I'll relay them to Emily. We've got one here. It's an earlier comment about the land acquisition side, and asked about land acquisition is not allowed, but purchasing conservation easements is. Was there a change or in anything with the program relating to the purchasing of conservation easements?
I think this was more of a lack of clarity in my presentation, potentially. Purchasing both land in fee simple and conservation easements is eligible under the Battlefield Land Acquisition Grant Program. Purchasing a conservation easement is considered an acquisition because you are purchasing the development interest in that land, which is kind of part of the package of rights that make up the property. So that is a land acquisition grant. And that's why they're not eligible for preservation planning grants, is because they would fall under a different grant program within the American Battlefield Protection Program.
Okay, great. Okay, a bunch of questions are coming in now. Where can we get a copy of the slides?
Good question. I think maybe we can follow up by email about where the recording can be accessed, or if we can post the PowerPoint.
Yeah, folks, I mean,
okay to follow up?
I'm sorry.
I was just asking if that would be all right to follow up with
an
email to attendees later.
Yeah, folks, I would, you can email Emily, or you can email, this is Brian Fainer, you can email me as well. But we can get you a copy of the slides. But, you know, again, all these webinars, this and others, are recorded, and they are can be found in our library that is on our Connected Conservation website, and there's a link to that website in the chat box. So stay tuned. You know, within the next week, we'll likely have a recording of this webinar posted there. All right. Can planning grants fund phase 1 archeological surveys?
They can. If it is one that is being done for Section 106 compliance, then they should not, because that would be something that would fall within the regular responsibilities of an agency or organization. But we do fund phase 1 level archeological investigations that are done for research purposes.
Okay. Can you talk a bit further about areas of conflict? Per the item of the west of the Mississippi, in many cases, there are fewer battlefields, but areas of local violence and conflict that are important. Okay, let me back up here again. let me actually, can you just talk a bit further about areas of conflict and what you meant by, you know, focusing on areas west of the Mississippi and places that may be a little bit outside of what most people would think of as a battlefield?
Sure. And I'd also like to invite our program manager, Christina Rado, to join the discussion if she would like to, but I'll give it a stab first. We did some research on the question of defining battlefields and defining armed conflict, and a lot of the armed conflict that we would say probably did shape the American West was not necessarily something that would fall into the kind of common Civil War definition of a battlefield, where you have two well-defined armies of people who are uniformed soldiers meeting up on a field. There are a lot of conflicts that were asymmetrical in nature, possibly not recognized as a war, where perhaps there was only a formalized army on one side. Or, for example, the Temecula massacre is an example of an asymmetrical conflict. There are conflicts that perhaps didn't ever receive the name of a war, but we might have the name of a battle or a specific event of collective violence. And I think that this is something that is part of the history of the American West in really not just the 19th century, but throughout colonization of the West, where there are different levels of recognition and different kinds of naming conventions that are given to armed conflict between settlers and indigenous people, or between different colonial powers, for example. And so we wanted to use a fairly widely internationally and historically recognizable term which is what armed conflict is, without being kind of anachronistic to the 19th century in terms of how we define a battlefield for a much broader span of history and for a much wider set of cultural experiences.
Great, thank you for that, Emily.
I'd also add, this is Christine, that our statute does specifically reference armed conflicts. And we had so many questions about what would be an eligible activity in an eligible site that this year we thought by providing a more expansive explanation of that kind of eligibility that it might invite potential applicants to think about how the lands or projects they'd like to support with preservation efforts could fit into this definition. So if there's a question, if you're struggling to figure out if a specific example might qualify, we'd be happy to sort of help you work through as a program those considerations.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that reference to our legislation. That is in large part where this came from.
Great. So again, essentially you're casting a much bigger net here for what might be able to, projects that could be funded. That's great. Okay, when it comes to partnerships, may there be multiple institutions, nonprofits, etc. So can partnerships, can multiple institutions get together for putting forward some of these grant proposals? Or does it actually be, is it work against a proposal?
I think right now we are set up to grant funds to one organization. There are potential structures for example, subawards that we haven't used for planning grants, where potentially multiple organizations could work together like they do on the land acquisition side. Generally, we have one main recipient though, but we do have recipients working in partnership with others pretty frequently. I'm not sure if that was a question about the project structure versus the funding structure. If the person asking wouldn't mind clarifying. In terms of project structure, it definitely does not work against you.
Okay. Here's another one. At what point do projects requiring other permitting, for example, archaeological work on NPS lands, need permits in hand? Is that, do folks need to have the permits to do that work before the application is put in, or can it be after?
I'm going to take two-part answer to that question. One is it is not required that permits be obtained prior to applying, but it is kind of part of the administration and implementation concerns that it be very clear from the application what the timeline for obtaining those permits is, that the applicant is prepared and understands that process and so on. And that also is the case for state permits, for example, or landowner permissions. And that the one second part of that question I would note though is that if it is for archaeological survey on NPS lands, it would be worth carefully considering that question of public purpose and making sure that what is being done would not be within the regular scope of NPS work.
Okay. Here's another one. Is this expected to be an annual program? If I'm unable to apply by January 31, 2021, can we expect a similar program in January 2022?
Yes, it's annual. It's actually been going on for many years, and we do expect it to continue being an annual program. The timeline changes a little bit year to year as the Department of the Interior processes sometimes change a little bit, but yes.
Okay. Do grants include sites in U.S. territories?
For this program, we have been able to fund grants for projects in the Republic of the Marshall Islands and areas like that in the Pacific.
Great, and this is kind of related. Would grants include, can they include submerged land battle sites like amphibious landings and things like that.
Yes.
Okay, here's another one. Can planning grants also be awarded for projects that are not reflected in the Civil War Sites Advisory Committee report as priority battlefields?
Yes.
So just to jump in here again, this is Christine. The report that question referenced, it's a very useful report, but the site, the survey codes for those are highly specific, and those are the eligibility survey codes for, as well as the Rev War and War of 1812 report for battlefield land acquisition grants. So we're talking about 4 grant programs under ABPP's administration, and those reports and those battlefields are highly specific to the grants that rely on funding that's tied to the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is battlefield land acquisition grants, interpretive modernization grants, and battlefield restoration grants. The program that Emily has highly focused on is the most expansive, which doesn't have a match and is not limited to those 3 armed conflicts.
And it is also the case for the planning grant program specifically, that because we don't rely on those reports with those specific listed sites, a conflict from the Civil War or a site from the Civil War that is not in that report would not be eligible for a battlefield land acquisition grant, but it could be eligible for a planning grant.
Great. Here's another question. With the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, does that have any bearings on planning grants that your program administers?
I don't think it has a direct impact on the planning grant program. The other grant programs funded through the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and having that be made permanent is definitely something that obviously is going to have an impact on those ongoing programs. But the planning grants are not funded through the Land and Water Conservation Fund. One area where the planning grants might be relevant is that if there are major projects that parks or programs are working on within gateway communities or with outside partners, if there is work that non-NPS partners need to do to help move those broader visions forward, these grants might be a possibility for the non-NPS organization to receive some funding to support that kind of work.
Oh, great. Yeah.
And could I also add, I mean, I think Emily said this earlier, but planning grants are also a great way for organizations, eligible organizations, to prepare, if they're eligible, for some of the other grant programs that are funded by the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So they could be used for kind of survey and documentation if needed, or some sort of consensus building or strategies to plan for, an acquisition or restoration or interpretive modernization in partnership with an eligible agency. So they could stack. I mean, you could see a planning grant combined with any other, not technically combined, but in preparation for those other funding opportunities competitively.
Okay. Here's another one kind of related. Does a nonprofit organization need a fiscal sponsor like the BLAG grants that are funded through LWCF?
I'm not sure that the term we would use for the role there is fiscal sponsor. The role of the state agencies in the BLAG grants, the land acquisition grants, is that they are, the state or local government has to be the primary recipient of those grants. So that's why nonprofits have to partner with a state or government, is because the statute establishing the grants requires that therefore state and local acquisition of lands. That is not the case for the planning grants. A 501c3 nonprofit organization could be a direct recipient of a planning grant.
Great. Let me slip in a question here. You mentioned and talked quite a bit about trying to increase the diversity of recipients, you know, with the updated program. What role can parks play in that, you know, individual park superintendents and park staff in trying to increase that, you know, diversify the recipients of these planning grants?
Well, I think first of all, we'd love for parks, superintendents, other NPS programs to help us get the word out, help us reach potential partners who you might have, local organizations within your communities who might not know about these grants, especially if you're talking about potential projects that the outside organization could lead. I think that as a national program, our knowledge of how we can best reach potential applicants within individual communities is necessarily more limited than people who are much more embedded in specific communities and might have local contacts and local partners. So that kind of help would be great. I'm also going to ask a couple of questions towards the end of this webinar if anyone would like to give us some advice on how we could do that with your help.
Great. Yeah, and folks, if you have suggestions or thoughts, you can just put them in the questions tab there, and I can relay them to Emily and Christine here. You mentioned, Emily, these upcoming webinars in November. Can you talk a little bit more about the scope and the types of topics that these webinars will be looking at?
Okay, we are still trying to nail down the calendar date around when our actual application will go live. But we are hoping that as soon as that application does go live, we'll be able to offer a few live and recorded webinars to try to reach potential new applicants. So a couple of the webinars will be tailored to audiences who we're hoping to reach, like Black history and preservation organizations, TIPOs and Indigenous researchers, potentially constituents of NPS programs that reach and fund external projects. And so that's something where, unfortunately, I don't have a schedule to give you today, but I'm definitely open to suggestions on what those might look like, and would love to follow up with anybody who wants to discuss.
Great. One thing that just I was just thinking about, so with this new definition of conflict, does social justice, race issues, does that can that fall under this updated, not definition, but new kind of framework for the program?
I think projects that address those, that meet the eligibility criteria in terms of being linked to an armed conflict and a site-based project, could be eligible for consideration, yes. And I think projects that try to make historic sites of armed conflict relevant today to people are certainly something that we'd like to see applications for.
All right, here's one more. Oh yeah, so there is some comment here about using social media to promote, you know, the new framework. Is that something you all are looking at for trying to get the word out?
Yes, definitely. And we're really excited that we have on detail Jessica Dumas, a park guide from Ford's Theater, who's going to be helping us a little bit as we put together our social media. If anybody has had any particularly successful social media campaigns on a related kind of relatively dry issue like this, we're definitely open to your advice. It's no fat bears, but we do our best.
I would like to just jump in here and back up to this question about social justice. And I know Emily mentioned in a couple of the examples for BLAGs, but it's also applicable here, that the conservation outcomes that are desired aren't necessarily limited to cultural resources, as in the Fort Blakely example. There are both conservation and value outcomes for historic and natural resources in that project. And if one sort of thinks about social justice in terms of environmental justice, as she said, open space values that are part of a planning objective for a community that happen to take in sites of collective violence or sites of armed conflict would also qualify for this program. So it's a pretty broad brushstroke of thinking about environmental justice and how that relates to historic preservation and open space planning.
Great. There's one other question here. Forgive the tech challenge. Where could I find everyone's contact information? You know, if they have some additional questions and thought, how can they get a hold of you folks?
Oh, I'm gonna put that on the last slide. But I'll also just say out loud right now that you can contact us at our program initials ABPP for American Battlefield Protection Program at nps.gov. But again, I will come back to that on the last slide. So to proceed toward the last slide, I also wanted to just throw out a couple of questions for the people on this call about whether you have any idea about people who could benefit from these grants, organizations or communities who we might not know or have thought of. And if you have any suggestions for how we can be working with our colleagues in the Park Service. Constructive criticism time. And if you'd like to follow up by email later, if something strikes you in the middle of the night of, you know, a partner you've thought of who you would like to recommend they apply or something like that, please feel free to send an email or give me a call.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Emily. We're getting close on time here. Any last, well, I'm sorry, do you have some more questions here? I'm sorry.
I did, I'm sorry. So this is, I guess, another question to leave people with, and I'd be really happy to talk with anybody about this if you have ideas. We're also starting to think about barriers to entry for people in applying for this funding. We know applying for federal grants is not a very simple process, and we would love to figure out how to reduce those in ways that are feasible. And so we'd love to hear ideas, advice. Problems don't have to come with solutions, just to help us think through this. And here is our contact information, our general program email, and I've included my colleague Philip Bailey as well as myself on there. Philip is going to be the primary point of contact for new applications for this year's planning grant cycle. You can reach us both at this email address as well.
Great, thank you so much, Emily and Christine. A lot of it's just so fun to learn about all these really awesome programs within the Park Service that really can support protecting all this great history and help the communities and, you know, beyond parks themselves. And so this is just one of many great, awesome programs that it's great to get the word out on. I wanted to just let everyone know that the next webinar is going to be on October 14 at 3 o'clock Eastern time, and it's on enhancing collaborative conservation of a fragmented metapopulation of desert bighorn sheep. So it's taken a turn more to the natural resource side of park resources. And I'm going to go ahead and put a link to where you can register for that in the chat box. Again, all these, this recording and you can register for the next webinar are on our NPS Connected Conservation website. So everything you need is there, and I encourage you to explore that website and let us know what you think. So with that, Emily and Christine, thank you again for an awesome presentation, Emily. A lot of great, exciting new information there. So I'm really glad you guys were able to present. And it seems like it's pretty timely too, right? With the deadline somewhat coming up for new grants.
Yes.
Great.
Well, thank you so much for having us, and thanks to everybody who joined.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, you too. Bye, everybody.